Welcome back. If you join me for part one of the finishing of this walnut coffee table with epoxy pour, this will be part two. And I'm going to start out by just going over the table a little bit just to show some of the things that what shows up after one coat of Osmo Polyx and what I'm looking to try to fix with second and third coats. There's still a lot of open grain here, which is a product of this being a stump cut. It changes a little bit when we have roots that were coming out. It gets to be a little bit straighter grain, but wherever we're into the tree rings here, we have very open grain. Get to where we can find focus there, and you can see that one coat hasn't filled that. So I'll be curious to see as we build up the Osmo Polyx if that can fill that grain or if it's going to stay open. A little closer look gives us an idea of the beautiful green on this piece that was used, and also a couple little flaws to deal with. There's some bubbles here that showed up after the first coat that couldn't see when I was sanding it, and the only fix I can do for these is to actually drill down and then fill with epoxy again. I have to decide what to do there. And some small pits here. They look a lot bigger zoomed in, but the Osmo may or may not fill those with subsequent coats, so we'll see what happens there. These are really hard to deal with, some small bubbles that were in the epoxy. Very hard to fill when you try to do a second layer of epoxy or anything, because I didn't want to get epoxy into the wood. When you have bubbles that are right on the edge of between the wood and the epoxy, I tried to fill a lot of little flaws, but I did not want to get epoxy into the wood grain, which would have required probably surfacing again almost to get that completely gone. So there was a few that I left to see what the finish would do. Some other little spots where the wood itself has a bit of an opening in the grain. Those I don't think the Osmo will fill, we'll see. And some spots where the epoxy didn't quite sink in enough. This is actually the bottom of the piece. Once I got it poured and surfaced, I decided I liked it better than what I had thought would be the top. So there's a couple spots where epoxy may have filled if I had been pouring upright. This was, soaking in from the bottom. So with that, I'll also show here's the table itself, ready to go, waiting for the top. Nothing real fancy. The legs are kind of neat. I decided to do 9 pieces to make the legs. Since I didn't have any thick stock, I was stacking. 3/4 inch would have given me 3 pieces to get 2 1/4, but I would have had one face that was clean grain and one face that had 3 different grains showing. So to avoid that change, I decided to cut them all and make all the faces the same. So we end up with 9 pieces making up a leg. And I even tried to mix up the grains just to make it more of a feature. Came out looking pretty uniform in the end, but I thought if I change the grains and try to flip the pieces, then it might add a little bit of character to the table. Also allowed me to cut short and long pieces here to create a pocket for the shelf, which makes it real easy to mount, very strong and a nice look. One mistake, if anyone wants to try this, one mistake I made was that I took a drop after cutting the table to size, and I used that piece to make the pocket when I was gluing the legs up, but the shelf hadn't been sanded yet. And so after I ran this through the drum sander, this was thinner than the drop that I used to create that pocket. So my pockets ended up being a little bit oversized, and I had to do a little bit of shimming and filling on the bottom side. So if you want to create a leg like this, make sure that the piece you use to create that pocket during glue up is sanded to the same thickness as what you're going to put into the pocket. Anyway, I can't wait to get these two together with the top married to the base and see what it looks like. But first, we need to go back here and get a second coat on. Alright, here we are ready to go with coat number 2 using Osmo Polyx on this walnut coffee table with an epoxy pour. If you didn't see part 1, you probably want to start there. It's going to be a better video to watch just because the first coat is always the best when the brings out the color of the grain. But I'm really hoping for this coat is that it's going to deepen the colors, really make them pop a little more. Hopefully fill some of this open grain and let us see the color of the epoxy a little bit more, because it's a little dull after the first coat yet. I sanded the epoxy with up to 600 grit, hoping that that would be adequate with the finish, bringing it out. But after the first coat, it's still a little bit dull, so we'll see what happens after the second coat. And I may end up going, I think I'm going to need at least a third coat because of this open grain of the stump cut. I think I'll need a third coat for sure. And I may try buffing it after that. We'll see what the finish looks like once we get a second coat layered on here. I'm going to really work it in, trying to get the Osmo to work into the pores of this wood. So far, you know, when it's wet, everything looks good when it's wet, right? It's really making this wood come to life here. Hopefully once it's wiped down at the end here, we'll still see that. This being a satin finish, it's of course not going to be glossy, and I didn't want glossy. It was tempting to do just a clear epoxy pour over this table because of that would have been the best thing to fill in any flaws and to fill in this open grain. But I didn't want to end up with a gloss finish. It looks pretty when you got the right angle, but any kind of sunlight, when this is a functional table, any kind of window light or anything coming, you're going to get some severe glare off it, which is, to me, unpleasant when you're sitting at a table, especially if it's between you and a TV or something like that. You certainly don't want to have light glaring off the table at you. So that would have been by far the easiest way to bring this out. But wouldn't have been a good end result, I don't think. So we're going to try building up this Osmo Polyx instead and see what we get out of it. And you can buff. This stuff is typically applied to floors. It's the most common usage of these hard wax oils, and put on with a buffer. And so I can come back and hand buff, or might use just a rotary buffer, and come back at the end and see if it needs any extra attention. You can see this second coat here is not going to take much product at all. I didn't put a lot in the cup to start, and I've only used a little bit of it because the grain has already soaked up most of what it's going to, pretty much all of what it's going to for the wood itself, and now we're just filling in whatever will work down into this open grain. After coat one, it didn't feel like it was done, and that's what I mentioned in part one of the video, that I tried Rubio monocoat on a similar table, and after one coat it just didn't feel like you were done with it, like you needed to do more. And this was the same way after one coat, with the grain soaks up so much of it when you have end grain. It didn't feel like I was done. And that's the reason I tried the Osmo here instead of the Rubio, since it's meant to be put on more than one layer. You can do one layer if you get the result you want, but it's also okay to build it up. I should have a little better camera angle on this one. I think on part one, where I had the camera, there was a little bit of more glare on the piece, so should be a better setup to let the wood speak. And then once again, I'm going to go underneath just a little bit. It's about 1.5 inch lip or the tabletop will overhang the base, and anywhere that someone might put a hand, one extra coat down here just so that it's smooth and nice whenever someone goes to move the table or puts their hand on the edge under the table. Just one coat of this on the back side, and I think that's plenty to seal it. Now we're just going for look and feel with the second coat here. Make sure I got enough on this back edge where I wasn't looking when I did it. Okay, that should pretty much do for getting it worked in. And I'm going to let it sit for about 10 minutes before I wipe it down, so there'll be a break here, and then we'll be back to see what it looks like. Alright, it's been about 10 minutes since I put this coat on. In the meantime, I just continue to work it in, trying to get it down into the grain, and specifically looking at like some of those little pit areas or little bits of open grain. Trying to work it in there and see if I can get it to fill a little better. I'm not sure if it will or not. There definitely still exist, but like I mentioned before, I'm probably going to end up doing a third coat, and hopefully that will just continue to make those smaller and smaller as it builds up in there. Still have open grain, and it's likely going to just stay that way, I think, regardless third coat or not. I'll put one on just to see. There's the hard oil wax, so there's the waxes. The oil will continue to soak in. The wax part of it, hopefully, I thought it would maybe continue to build and fill these pores, but it's not going to. It's all sealed, so as far as usability, it's not going to hurt anything. And it probably is actually, when it's dry, it's probably going to give the wood a really nice texture with that grain the way it is. So I don't think it's going to be any kind of no one considered a flaw to have the open grain. Just naturally, I think we want things to come out perfectly flat and level, and in that regard, it seems like I should want it to be all the grain to be filled and smooth, but it might end up looking better when you have that grain showing and it get the character of the wood instead of just a flat finish. And I can see out of here that I think I'm definitely going to want to buff it when I'm done, because the epoxy just isn't popping like I would hope. It's got kind of it's pretty, but it's got kind of a dullness to it. Being as this is a satin finish, it's not surprising either. But this Osmo is meant to be buffed, so I think after a third coat I'll be running a buffer over it and find out what the end result is. You're using something new, you hope for what it's going to look like, but you won't know until it's done. I think there's a lot of potential with these hard wax oils. I like it. I love being able to just wipe it on and wipe it off, and you don't have any brush marks, you don't have anything. I think it's dry enough it doesn't pick up any kind of lint or anything that's floating around like a polyurethane will. If you don't have an absolute clean area and you've got polyurethane that sits there for hours, then anything floating in the air sticks to it, of course, and dust nibs. And this is just an easier thing to use here. Once I get it wiped off here, I don't think there's anything to worry about. Anything that settles on here, I believe, will just blow off because we don't have any wet product laying on the surface. that's it for coat 2. Really a pretty piece. Just a little more dull than I would hope for on the epoxy, but we'll see how that comes out in the end. So again, let me get in here for a little better view. And that's it for now. Unless I come back with coat 3 or with buffing. Thanks for watching.